First, let me thank the organizers and our hosts for this excellent event. Very well organized, very efficient, and it is good to be back in Korea. It's been a number of years since I've been in Korea, but I've been here many, many times working with the Ministry of Finance. Let me give you a little bit of background about myself. I am not an academic. I'm a practitioner. Like you, I've spent most of my career in ministries of finance, either in the United States, at the federal level or at the state level, or in other governments as well. I was actually assigned to work in the ministries of finance in Hungary, Argentina, and Croatia. And then since I've been with the bank, I've spent, and the IMF, I've spent most of my time, of course, with ministries of finance around the world, dealing with whatever the issue happens to be. So the situation we find ourselves in today with high inflation is not new. I mean, it's something that certainly I've dealt with before, worked in countries that have had that problem. I want to be clear that I'm not talking about cases of hyperinflation, right? Technically, I believe Turkey does qualify, has triggered the International Accounting Standards reporting requirements for hyperinflation conditions, which is a cumulative inflation rate of 100% over 3 years. But hyperinflation causes very strange things to happen to the budget process. And one very good example is from Argentina, which until they introduced their fixed exchange rate in the early 90s, was having 300% inflation a year, massive inflation. And it is the only country I'm aware of that when they were under that period of hyperinflation, they stopped preparing a budget. There was no point really in preparing a budget, so they stopped preparing a budget, and they didn't for probably almost a decade until they introduced their currency controls and brought inflation under control. Those extreme cases are kind of not what I'm talking about. I'm trying to talk a little bit more about typical inflationary periods. So, first thing to look at, of course, is revenues. And during inflationary periods, revenues tend to be the first thing you notice, and the first thing that appears in your reports, your fiscal reports, is that they generally rise during inflationary periods. Anything that's rate-based, a sales tax, a sin tax, a VAT tax, will bring in more government revenue just on its own. And that's really the short-term immediate effect, and this will continue as long as the inflation rate exists, which in the early days of an inflationary period will make your balance sheet look pretty good. Secondary effects from these increases in revenues would include income taxes. Part of that will depend on the secondary effect of wage increases, which governments may not allow in full to cover the cost of living or cost of inflation. They may do it in part, but as those rise, some incomes will rise, income tax revenue will rise, corporate tax revenue will rise, and eventually real estate taxes will rise as the real estate prices rise. Part of it will depend on whether or not your tax rates are indexed, your income tax or corporate tax rates are indexed, if there are bands and different rates apply to different bands. If they're not indexed for inflation, as incomes rise, you get pushed into a higher tax bracket, essentially, and that will bring in more revenue. And that is also an automatic fiscal stabilizer in a way. It will start pulling back on the ability of consumption in the economy. So generally, these revenues will materialize before you see costs increasing. And as I mentioned, your balance sheet will start looking very good. This will create pressure in governments to reduce taxes. It will create pressure also to try to offset the impact of inflation on the population. You're seeing in the UK, for example, where they've just proposed a new budget amendment to increase subsidies to households. Now, whether or not that's wise to do in an inflationary period is perhaps open for debate. Some would argue that that's not a wise thing to do, especially if it's not targeted very carefully. So the ministries of finance will will feel this pressure. If the balance sheet looks good, and you'll see the pressure from politicians to try to spend and help people, which, in principle is a good thing, but it should be targeted to the poor primarily. Now, the expenditure impact on inflation tends to be more gradual, as I was implying already. And discretionary spending, which is the amount of money you allocate every year to some programs, and it's variable. It's completely dependent on the policies of the government, and there's no underlying law that requires the spending to increase. Generally, during a budget period, these will remain fixed, right, for the short term, so a 12-month period of whatever period your budget is, unless you amend it. That's true for public sector wages as well. And if you're not renegotiating the wage levels or not increasing the wage levels, those stays fixed for the period. But you will start seeing pressure from the unions and from the public employees, of course, to try to increase wages, increase spending to support them. And this is something we are seeing already in many countries, in Europe in particular. We're seeing a lot of interest in increasing the public sector wage bill. And the cost of goods and services purchased by the government will rise, and this is one of where you see a little bit of a trickier impact of inflation that ministries of finance kind of need to be aware of. Those ministries, those departments that have programs that do a lot of procurement, they spend a lot in buying goods and services. It could be the health ministry buying vaccines, it could be a transport ministry buying buses, etc. They will see the impact of inflation first, right? So it's going to hit them pretty quickly. So across the government, you won't see each ministry being affected the same way, and that's something to be very mindful of. And especially if the government is concerned about pro-poor spending, those programs that are benefiting the poor may be most adversely affected more quickly than some of the other ministries. Almost universally, what I have seen is that where there is inflationary pressure, there's a couple of ministries that tend to be favored, or they get increases first. Ministry of Defense almost always gets the money it requests. Ministries of Internal Affairs, dealing with police, etc. Those types of ministries have an unfair claim on the budget in normal times, but also during inflationary times. And that's something to be mindful of. One of the things that I have found, and that some countries have done, this is fairly common certainly in Eastern Europe these days, and less so in Latin America, is to provide ministries more flexibility, in lieu of allowing them to get a budget increase within the fiscal year or in the short term. They might be given flexibility to shift resources within their budget across different activities with limits, with very clear limits. For example, you can allow them in the non-personnel spending to move money around to help maintain service delivery levels, because you don't want those to suffer too adversely. So giving them the flexibility to make those changes without having to go through too many hurdles or too many hoops is something that can help ease the impact of inflation on the spending ministry. Generally, there are a couple of control points that any Ministry of Finance needs to maintain. First is the total spending for the ministry, the second is personnel spending, and the third is kind of capital spending. Capital spending will be adversely affected by inflation, especially if you have cost-plus contracts that you're using to have things built, whether it be highways or buildings. But giving the agency some flexibility within those three, or only within the non-personnel spending, is helpful for them. But if you allow them to shift between personnel, capital, etc., I've universally seen that abused by ministries in Europe, Latin America, Asia, everywhere, Africa. They will generally shortchange the personnel budget and use that money to buy other things, and then have a shortfall in payroll before the end of the fiscal year. And that obviously creates a major political problem for the government. You can't just not pay people for the last 2 months of the year. But I've seen that in countries you'd be surprised. EU member states I've seen it there, and I've seen it in middle-income countries. It's a common trick that gets played by spending ministries. So that's something just to be mindful of. Also to be mindful of is taking short-term decisions that have long-run implications. I have seen in some countries, ministries will eliminate maintenance spending for a given year. And that's okay maybe for a year, for a short-term fix or a little bit more flexibility. It is not okay, obviously, over a longer-term period of time. I see this most commonly in Africa, where facilities maintenance will be regularly rated every year because of some crisis. And as a result, a building that was built to last 30 years will last 10 years and will have to be replaced much sooner. Obviously, that means it was a bad investment because your whole cost-benefit ratio changes once you let things like that happen over a longer period of time. And so what might have been a good public investment initially turns out to be a very bad one because it has to be replaced. I already mentioned about the procurement contracts. That type of procurement contracts will show how quickly the inflation will impact some of the spending of government. Now, government mandatory spending, which may include pensions, Social Security, these are usually benefit-type programs that are mandatory benefits to the people. These may or may not be indexed. If they're indexed, this can eat up the budget very quickly if they're fully indexed for inflation, and can become a major hazard. In the US, this is one of the areas that is a problem. And fortunately, in some of the larger programs, while they're technically indexed, the government decides what that index is going to be on an annual basis, what that movement will be. So it's another thing to keep in mind. This usually requires a legislative change, not just a new budget, but a legislative change. There are a few countries like Sweden that have moved everything onto the discretionary budget. Pensions, everything. Even though the benefits are defined, it has to be approved every year in the annual budget, how much they're going to spend on pensions. They did that because of they were a country that went through a serious fiscal shock in the early 90s and very successfully came out of it and sustained a fiscal soundness over a longer period of time. But this is one of the things they had to reform. Secondary effects under inflation that happen, pension funds are something that always have to be kept an eye on. You have a number of effects that will happen. One will be the pension funds, if they are fully funded and they're investing their resources, inflation can have an impact, especially secondary impacts of interest rates, effects on the stock market, effects on the currency, exchange rates, and investments can suffer if a fully funded pension system is impacted. And so that's something that just needs to be keep an eye on, and it may require some legislative changes down the road to change the benefit levels, potentially, or the amount of money that gets put into it. A lot of the states in the US are now very much worried about this. Their pension funds, because it's being adversely affected by the stock markets, and they're going to probably have to put in annual revenues to make up for that loss in the not too distant future. Debt and debt service is another area that is impacted by inflation, and in some ways you can view it as positive because the real value of the debt will decline, right, over an inflationary period. So you're paying the same debt amounts with inflated currency. So for the government, it's essentially inflating itself out of a debt burden. That has adverse consequences for investors, for people who want to buy up bonds, because they're going to be less likely to do it unless they get better interest rates, et cetera. So it's going to have quite an impact on countries. The other thing we're very worried about is countries that have a lot of short-term debt. They've not consolidated their debt and moved into longer-term securities because they will have to replace at higher interest rates in the near term. And there's a lot of countries in Africa in particular that are in debt distress, and this is going to push them over the edge. where there's going to have to be probably a major debt restructuring, that we're seeing a lot of talk around that, particularly in Africa, the highly indebted poor countries. And you know, nobody expected this to happen, but it obviously did, and they're suffering. Now, some of the observed trends and responses to kind of the inflationary pressures that we're seeing are very much things that have been discussed here. State-owned enterprises is one that I am most worried about because it tends not to be on the radar of many ministries of finance. Serbia is a very good case where currently their treasury looks very good. They have a very positive balance sheet because the revenues have been increasing, the expenses have not been increasing as much, but they have not been paying attention to the state-owned enterprises, particularly the utilities that have to buy energy, right, and purchase energy to maintain electricity. They are hit by this inflation almost immediately. And the rates they can charge is often regulated by the government. So their income is fixed and their costs go up. And that doesn't usually mean a good balance sheet for the state-owned enterprises, and frequently they will need to be bailed out. For the bank, we're also very concerned about this because many state-owned enterprises are critical in achieving the SDGs, the development goals, for water, access to electricity, et cetera. The SOEs are right front and center in delivering those. And if they get hit very hard, we're going to have a major problem. And this is something that I know that Korea has paid attention to in the past, that they had a lot of debt that state-owned enterprises were holding, and they've made efforts to try to clean that up and to enable full cost recovery. There's always a flip side, the political economy of these issues. The state-owned enterprises, particularly in Central Asia, where governments have tried to raise rates, electricity rates, for example. This has also happened in Africa. The government tries to raise the rates, not necessarily to full cost recovery, but they try to raise the rates to cover shortfalls, and it creates domestic unrest. In the case of the Kyrgyz Republic, I think there were 3 coups over 10 years where the people just rose up and threw out the government because they had no confidence that the government would use those revenues for actually improving the utility. They were pretty convinced it would be corrupt, it would be stolen. So trying to raise rates created a massive political problem that ended up changing the government. So those things always have to be, the political economy of those issues has to be taken into account. Now globally, I'm seeing a lot of renewed interest and requests for support on efficiency, public sector performance measures to try to get more out of what is being spent. And under the realization that there's not going to be a lot more money coming in because of the economy and various issues. A lot more emphasis on anti-corruption, on transparency, on improving the transparency of public spending and the contracts, the public contracts, to try to eliminate corruption, and that way make each won or dollar go further than it otherwise would. Big interest in public spending reviews. This is, I think, in anticipation of large fiscal retrenchments that are likely to happen in the near term. And many governments are wanting to introduce these on a permanent basis if they haven't done so already. So this is another very big trend. Fiscal forecasting and improving fiscal forecasting. Is something that we've also been seeing a lot of requests for. This is true for central banks as well as ministries of finance, ministries of economy. A lot of the models they are using don't adequately reflect what's happening with the inflation. The models they're using often expect the inflation to return to a normal level, about 2% after a year. But that's not coming true again and again. So there needs to be some new examination and some adjustment to the fiscal forecasting to get a sounder basis for the annual budget. Heightened tensions, I think I already mentioned this to some extent, between social safety net spending and to increase spending to reduce the burden of inflation, while the need at the same time is to be fiscally restrained, to reduce spending, to either increase taxes or cut spending so that inflation is brought under control more quickly. And a couple of things I did want to mention that I didn't put in the slides, but these are more for discussion, is just to raise again the issue of political economy, the importance of trying to manage that. Ministries of Finance are technical bodies, but they have a massive role to play in educating the politicians on the impact of their decisions, and a major role to play in educating society on the impact of the economy and budget decisions on the country. I did a study a number of years ago on extreme fiscal adjustments. We looked for countries around the world that had to adjust their budget spending by 9 percentage points or more in a year, so very rapid fiscal retrenchments, and then who were able to sustain that reduction and that fiscal balance for at least 5 years. And we came up with a handful of countries. They included Thailand, Turkey, and that was during the early 2000s when they had their crisis, Sweden, the Netherlands, etc. Most of those those crises that led to those huge fiscal retrenchments were market-driven, the market that caused it to happen. There was only one that took a political decision to undertake that retrenchment, and that was the Netherlands. But in doing that study, what we found in the ability of those countries to, A, undertake successfully that large retrenchment in spending, and B, sustain those reductions over at least 5 years, was highly dependent on the communications of the Ministry of Finance. Ministry of Finance being the main body that was trusted to educate the politicians and also the public of why these things were being done, the need to do them, the need to change pensions, the need to cut spending or to privatize, etc. So the success of these reform efforts really can depend on the ability of the Ministry of Finance to communicate clearly and simply to the public and increase transparency and trust in government. Now, having been in the Ministry of Finance, there's also a rule of thumb I have is never let a good crisis go to waste. So for Ministry of Finance, your influence goes up during a crisis, a fiscal crisis. And then true for inflation as well as the need for retrenchment. And that can let you make some changes you could not otherwise make because it changes the political economy and the political dynamics in the country. So in the U.S., there was always a very strong opposition to creating any fiscal rule and passing it in law and adhering to it. The politicians hated it. But the fiscal crisis that we had the U.S. had under stagflation in the 70s led directly to debate and pressure to introduce fiscal rules in the U.S. to try to put us on a stable trajectory. Now, it took 10 years from the, say, 72 to 82 for the U.S. to actually pass something, but it was the crisis of inflation and then the stagflation of the late 70s that let the U.S. Introduce fiscal rules, which is something the Ministry of Finance wanted to do, but it was not politically popular. But that changed with the crisis. It can also be a good opportunity to cut some of the programs you may want to cut. In some countries, there are fuel subsidies. I did some work in Iran a number of years ago, and the Iranians had a very large fuel subsidy for the general public, untargeted. Everyone got it. Made traffic was horrible. I mean, Tehran is probably the worst traffic jams I have ever seen. Everyone has a car, and there's only one person in the car. The government Ministry of Finance had wanted to change that, but politically it was not popular. Once they started getting hit with a fiscal crisis, some of it inflation and some of it sanctions related, they had to retrench, and that was one of the first things they were finally able to change, and to make it a targeted program that only went to the poorest households. It wasn't a general subsidy for everyone. So these crises can be opportunities to make some of these significant changes that ministries of finance know need to be made, but otherwise they can't make them. That really was the main point I wanted to make, was that these can be opportunities. It's not just a burden for ministries of finance to have these crises. It's also a very key opportunity for the ministry to manage upward, to communicate, to help educate the politicians and educate the general public, and successfully make some of these adjustments. So let me stop there. Wanted to really just give a broader overview of kind of some of these major issues. In general, I would say inflation budgeting is not that different from regular budgeting. There's a few more things you need to kind of pay attention to in terms of equity and fairness, but it is it's an opportunity as well, not just a burden or a crisis. So thank you very much, and I look forward to discussions.